You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
All right, Dolphins, welcome to another week of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. Give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. No victory Monday tonight as the Dolphins were boat raced in Buffalo, losing 48-20 to the hated Buffalo Bills, marking 10 out of the last 11 and I believe 12 out of the last 14 times the two teams have played. The Bills have gotten the better of the Dolphins. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'll give my overall thoughts on the game. We're going to dissect a lot of what went wrong on the defensive side, and we'll go from there. No preview of the Giants as they are playing currently as I'm recording this on Monday night. Before we dive in, no new whiskey segment this week, and no Log of 11 for us because, well, we ended up on the wrong side of a beatdown this week. But that's life in the NFL, and tonight we'll be sipping on some Bushmills Prohibition Edition from the Peaky Blinders, the Tommy Shelby branded whiskey that Bushmills has put out, a working man's whiskey, and the Dolphins have a lot of work to do after, I'll just call it what it is, they got autopsied by Buffalo. We'll have our sip of the Bushmills. Good stuff for a working man's whiskey. But let's dive into it. And we'll just start with it. Tip your cap to Sean McDermott and his staff. They ran absolute circles around what the Dolphins did, especially Vic Fangio. More on that later on in the show. And tip your cap to Josh Allen. That was about as close to a perfect performance as you're going to see from a quarterback. He had a perfect quarterback rating, 158.3. He had as many touchdowns as he had incompletions, 4 apiece, throwing for 320 yards and just obliterating the Dolphins as he seems to almost always do. And this one stings a lot because I think it's safe to say now that of the 3 games last year, Josh Boyer did a better job on his side of the ball than Mike McDaniel has done on his. And Josh Boyer did a better job all 3 times last year than Vic Fangio did in week 2. That was abysmal, did in week 4. That was abysmal by Fangio, and he needs to change his meatball recipe or whatever it is he's doing. Because things smell, and it smells fishy, and I don't like where things are headed as a defense. So we'll save that as the meat of the show. Offensively, I thought the Dolphins had a pretty good plan coming out. You know, the Bills have always kind of found a way to limit Tyreek Hill. I thought Mike McDaniel did a really nice job early on, sticking with the run game. You know, Devon Achane, 8 carries, 101 yards, 2 scores. You know, even Raheem Mostert had a couple nice carries early on, but then the fumble before half when it was 21-14 looked like it was going to make it. You had a chance to kind of go 2 for 1 and possibly tie or take the lead coming into the third quarter, and that went awry and kind of up in smoke went the game plan. McDaniel reminds me a lot of when Jim Tressel coached at Ohio State. And I know a lot of people out there hate Ohio State, but maybe you'll understand the analogy. And you think back to the national championship game when they played Florida. Jim Tressel's MO at Ohio State was that he could never really coach when the team was down. And if they got down by 10 or more, he panicked and things went awry and they almost always lost. McDaniel is the same way. He admitted it today in his media that he went away from the run too early. And when you lost Teron Armstead, things just kind of crumbled from within. Looking at the game tape, I don't believe any of those sacks fall on Tua himself. I think it's just bad offensive line play. And, I think we learned through, we'll call it the quarter pole of the season. Yes, I know there's 17 regular season games, but through the first quarter, air quotes there, of the season, we learned that Miami can sustain losing Teron Armstead, but they can't sustain losing Connor Williams and Teron Armstead. It seems like only one or the other can be missing for that offensive line to still function relatively properly. Liam Eichenberg at center was a disaster, and I do think that the overreactions to Miami's offensive line were in fact overreactions, but to not have a true center on the roster at this point to back up Connor Williams, that chicken came home to roost. And we'll see what happens moving forward, because it sounds like Teron Armstead may be out multiple weeks, not just a week. Situation to monitor there. And at this point, you kind of have to wonder, at what point does he consider just stepping away with all the injuries? I wouldn't blame him if he did. He's obviously a tremendous left tackle when he's healthy, but that's kind of coming fewer and further between. But I hope this game, if anything, showed how idiotic it was to place blame at Connor Williams. Yes, there's a couple snaps that weren't perfect. But he's a top 3 center in football. There's no denying it at this point. And he's going to get paid. And honestly, if I were Miami, I would pay him ahead of Robert Hunt. I would pay him ahead of Isaiah Wynn. I would pay him ahead of Austin Jackson. Center is much more important in this offensive scheme than guard play. We can talk about off-season moves, on the offensive line and stuff in another episode, but that's my stance there. Only getting 7 touches to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, I think is a bit bad on McDaniel's part, and let's just call a spade a spade. Let's be open and honest in this episode about a lot of things. Mike McDaniel as a third and short play caller stinks. He just does. He has last year, and for whatever reason, he stinks on ice against the Bills more than any other team. I don't understand it. The man will outthink himself. I don't fully understand where he was going with the 2-point conversion call. I get it if it works, because it still keeps you within a 2-score game if Buffalo scores again. It allows you to keep that math, but just didn't feel right at the time. Not that it mattered, because at that point you kind of knew the cat was out of the bag. There was no stopping Buffalo at that point. Just a dismal display on defense. Offensively, I think what the Bills did, I guess, provides you a silver lining, because it shows you exactly how to beat this offense. Rather than trying to rush to get to Tua, they're rushing to get to spots to get their hands up and knock down several passes. They would automatic a corner blitz anytime there were no receivers to a side. Didn't matter if they were tight ends or not, they would automatic to it, because most of the time Miami's executing a play fake and rolling back to that side where there's no receivers. Much like how blitzing a corner defeated the Wildcat 15 years ago, Buffalo automaticing to those corner blitzes kind of lays a blueprint for some things to come, and especially when you're missing Teron Armstead, those are going to kind of wreck your game plan. And then being able to play, 2-man and cover 2 variations with a cloud safety above Tyreek Hill at all times, you're not going to get beat deep Buffalo has enough pass rushers that can win one-on-one matchups, especially against Kendall Lamb when Teron Armstead is out. Buffalo's roster is constructed almost perfectly to beat Miami, and with Matt Milano, they've got one of the few linebackers in the league not named Fred Warner who can do a lot of special stuff over the middle of the field and kind of muddy that picture. I'm curious to see what would have happened had Miami been a little bit better on defense and maybe been able to keep it at 21 points at half or 24 points, keep it a 10-point game. What might have happened or how much that plays into McDaniel going away from the run. But that game kind of got away from them very quickly, and I tend to think McDaniel gets a little frantic. And after talking with some other folks that are kind of knowledgeable about McDaniel that cover, other teams McDaniel has been a part of, I sort of came to a conclusion. I will say, if you follow Major League Baseball, you'll know a team in the Midwest who's had a lot of success. Their ownership group's a big name. The owner's on a lot of the big committees. I worked for his son prior to my current job. Multimillionaire, maybe a multi-billionaire, I don't know specifically, but kind of one of those people who I remember sitting at his desk in the spring of 2020 and found a report I had turned into him in December of 2013. Just one of those people who has clutter all over, business cards all over the place, reports all over the place. But when you talk to him, one of the smartest people you ever meet. But sort of, I won't say goldfish brain, but sort of space cadetish, where if you're talking about a financial report and what you need to do next quarter to boost sales by 5%, and you mention red wine or white wine, all of a sudden you're talking about different varieties of grapes and residual sugars in your Riesling. And he's going in depth on that. Mike McDaniel kind of reminds me on that, and I think he's a little too heavily influenced in his play calling based on the score of the game. I think what Miami needed to do was try and sit and shorten that game, especially when they proved they had no real answer on defense for Buffalo early on in that game. You needed to make the clock your friend, even if you're down a little bit, and they didn't do it. And I think that's kind of been a repeated thing against the Bills in these 4 matchups now that Mike McDaniel's faced them. I thought, we'll turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball. I thought that Vic Fangio's style of play would lead Miami to playing a game plan that was similar to what they did last year in Week 3 when Josh Boyer basically gave up the cover 1 stuff after the Bills got to 14 points and started emptying his play sheet and started calling every boutique coverage he had under the sun and spying Josh Allen. Well, Miami didn't do that, and you're playing these shell coverages, but you've got a lot of problems with how you're deploying the personnel and what you're doing. And I think the easiest way for me to unpack this is I'm shooting completely off the cuff tonight. There's no real script, just kind of what's been on in my head after watching the game again. What we'll do is we'll start from the defensive line and work our way back and kind of step through these errors. Because I think if they're not corrected, what will end up happening, in my mind, is you're going to see Miami, I don't want to predict scores, but I think you'll be able to beat the Giants and the Panthers relatively comfortably. But then you got to go to Philly. I think what might happen is you end up 5-1, and then you go and get absolutely buzzsawed on national TV. Then you regroup, you get a game or two, and then you got to play the Chiefs in Germany, and maybe you get buzzsawed again. So what I'm getting at here is I think, provided the offense stays at the level that it's at, is Miami's trending toward a team that's going to end up being good but not great. And I predicted 11-6 on the Finside the NFL panel back at the start of the season. We had to go game by game, record-wise through it. The only one I've missed so far, I had Miami losing in week 1 to the Chargers. I had them losing to Buffalo. I have them losing to Philly. I have them losing to Kansas City, all in the first half of the season. But I never anticipated the defense to be as bad as it was on Sunday. So let's dive into this. We'll be open. We'll be honest. I may lose a few followers. There's probably a couple Dolphins players that, if they were actually to listen to the podcast, would not be very fond of me coming up. So that's your disclaimer. Let's start with the good on the defensive line. Going into the season, I thought that Miami might have a little bit of a dip in run defense just because of the light box structure that Fangio deploys. They were 4th in the league last year, giving up, I think it was 103 yards a game. So far through 4 games, 3 of the games have been about on par with what you'd expect last season. Now, if you go and you look up their statistical average as it ranks with the rest of the league, that week 1 performance against the Chargers, obliterates their averages and their rankings, and they're not going to be anywhere near the top 5. But they held the Bills to 104 yards rushing on 29 carries. There's 3 kneel downs put into that. So it's really 107 yards on 26 carries. And that's with a 29-yard run to Latavius Murray baked in where you missed several tackles. But James Cook had a 2.4 yards per carry average. Damian Harris had 6 for 29 but never really got going. Josh Allen didn't really kill you the way he did last year, 4 for 17. Really, the long run to Murray was what put the Bills over 100 yards rushing on the day. They did pretty well against Denver the week before. They did really well against New England the week before that. I don't feel bad about the run defense, and I think you're pretty well set on your interior rotations with Christian Wilkins, Zach Sealer, Raekwon Davis, Deshaun Hand. There's not much I would change there. In terms of pass rush, though, when you're playing these light boxes, you've got to win with players off the edge. And I think it's safe to say at this point that Miami does not have an elite pass rusher. I don't think anyone's mistaking any of the top Dolphins rushers for like a Nick Bosa or a TJ Watt or a Myles Garrett. They just don't have that guy. But when Jalen Phillips isn't on the field, they don't even have a guy that's above average. Andrew Van Ginkel's probably the next best guy. I think Emmanuel Ogbah gives you some nice rushes here and there, but I think you need a stronger component opposite him in order to let him kind of do what he does best. And at this point in time, the Bradley Chubb trade looks like a waste. You're paying him all that money, and it's just not working. But what I would mention, and this is something that Chris Vasseur, Coach Vass on Twitter, has talked about with these Coach Fangio-style defenses, whether it's the Dolphins, whether it's the Chargers, whether it's Carolina, whoever, they often run very static fronts. And if you're Miami, excluding the goal line fronts, we've really only seen 4 looks the entire season. We've seen the 4-2-5 nickel using 2-4-5 personnel, which is basically what the Dolphins live in. We've seen a true 3-4 setup. We've seen a 4-1 in the dime. And then we've seen sort of this odd 4-man front where you're playing a D tackle out at defensive end with 2 linebackers mugged on the same side, and then a wide end on the backside where you're running a stunt or a game. And a lot of people have echoed this on Twitter without citing Coach Vass, but it's essentially you're breaking the huddle and the offense knows exactly how you're lining up. You're relying on those guys on the edge to win one-on-one, And that's just not something that Bradley Chubb has proven to be able to do during his time in Miami with any consistency. Andrew Van Ginkel's never really been that type of player. He can be a cleanup rusher, but he's not a win-first rusher and get to the quarterback. And then Jalen Phillips, did not play. So you're left kind of scrambling there. Miami did get 2 sacks, but I believe both of those were kind of on plays where Allen kind of ran around and then ran himself into a sack. Looking at that, who'd they credit? Both of them went to Van Ginkel, but they weren't just outright wins off the edge rushing. So defensive line, you're good against the run, but your edge players have got to be better against the pass. And I think there's going to be some fool's gold out there next week, because if Andrew Thomas doesn't play again for the Giants, you're going to start to see guys win, especially if Jalen Phillips gets back on the field. Miami's going to be able to win a lot against the Giants tackles, or at least they should be. If they don't, something's very, very wrong. The linebacking unit is a mess right now, but it's not necessarily because Fangio doesn't have personnel. It's because of how they're deployed. So you look at the previous games, both of the games where Andrew Van Ginkel's been exclusively an edge player. So that's week 2 in New England, and then yesterday against Buffalo. He's been productive, and David Long has been ultra productive. Long led the way with 7 solo tackles and 2 for loss, 10 total tackles yesterday. Had a sack in the New England game and had several run stops in that game. Andrew Van Ginkel is not a good off-ball linebacker. I don't know what Fangio sees there. It's a bad experiment. It needs to die now. Keep Van Ginkel on the edge. And I'd go so far, in fact, to say, Bradley Chubb's contract be damned, start Van Ginkel over him opposite Jalen Phillips at this point. If you're not getting anything out of Chubb, make him a third down specialist and see if you can move him around the front, which is another problem in and of itself. Pretty much the rushers are where they are. You're always going to see Chubb on the right. You're almost always going to see Phillips on the left. Van Ginkel's really the only guy that kind of goes left and right. Ogba's done it a tiny bit, but generally they're on the same sides, and you can prepare for that. So you've got a static front. You've got Van Ginkel as an off-ball linebacker. That doesn't fit. He's much better on the edge. It's clear as day. I don't know if that's a coaching thing or, if that's something that Anthony Campanelli is behind. I would question, Fangio was not allowed to he was not allowed to replace Austin Clark or Anthony Campanelli if he wanted. Those two guys stayed from the previous coaching staff, dating all the way back to Flores. So maybe there's sort of an odd fit in terms of teaching points and coaching points with those guys, especially Campanelli. I think Austin Clark has done a nice job with what he's got to work with so far. But the linebacking unit's a mess. Jerome Baker got a lot of flack from fans in the previous regime because I think he did a lot of things that people didn't notice. But now you just don't notice him. He's been noticeably poor every game this season. Vic Fangio even called him out publicly last week during his media availability. Interesting that the team only made those videos public on Friday night, so it kind of got lost. And then he benched Baker during the game. Jerome Baker needs to be a lot better than what he's been. But when you're replacing him with Duke Riley, that's someone who is a special teams only guy. If you're going to do that, what's the harm in putting Channing Tindall in? At least he's the best athlete you can field as a linebacker on this roster. I feel like that's probably the move that's going to happen down the road, just based on how things are baked into the 2024 salary cap with respect to Jerome Baker's contract. No pun intended. But that's a mess that you need to sort out and right quick, or else when you play Philly, you're going to get gouged on the ground despite what you do up front. I think Baker and both David Long need some work on their pass rush drops and getting to the correct spots. You look at the example of when Kader Kohu got absolutely obliterated by Stephon Diggs on the post corner route. Miami's either playing, cover zero from a softer look where you don't have everyone walked up, or it's some form of flat cover two. And it's just a mess. You've got, as Chris Kaufman pointed out on Twitter, you've got two safeties in the same spot and you've got two linebackers in the same spot. Now, I read that play as cover zero. And Kader Kohu just got absolutely abused. He got his ass handed to him all day. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But the linebackers haven't been very good dropping to spots or picking up guys in pass coverage. Even though the score of the Denver game was completely out of hand, Russell Wilson played fairly well for the first three quarters of that game. But when you're down by 30, 40, and then 50 points, what are you supposed to do? But it's been a mess there, and I think the solution has to be, you've got to figure out sooner or later, you've got to make David Long the 3-down guy. And then you've got to figure out ways to hide or bench Jerome Baker. I would, at this point, go ahead and play Channing Tindall and just give him reps. Unless you're planning some sort of move before the trade deadline of adding, a quality linebacker. I don't know who that would be. But you can't live like this and play like this and expect to go far in the playoffs with this defense. Now, moving back to the secondary, obviously not having Jalen Ramsey, that's a big piece to the puzzle, and you can move him around in various ways. And I know, just from talking to some sources, that was a big part of Fangio's plan, and you don't have that capability at the moment. But it's contemptibly stupid to play Kader Kohu exclusively as a perimeter corner. I've talked about this last year. I don't care what metric you show me. He is not an outside corner. He is a slot guy and a slot guy only. Play him as such. Stephon Diggs tore him about 4 new assholes on Sunday, and it wasn't even close. Why you did not move Xavier Howard over to Stephon Diggs or have him shadow Stephon Diggs, I don't know. That's a question that you would have to talk with Sam Madison and Xavier and Coach Fangio about. But that's a bad look. That's a terrible look to be at this point in the season. You're going to leave Kader Kohu out there to get abused. You're willingly choosing to play Justin Bethel as a nickel in order to play Kader Kohu outside and not play Cam Smith, who you just spent a second-round pick on, or Eli Apple, who started the first couple games, outside in order to get Kader Kohu in the slot. That's just stupid on a lot of levels. And I don't know if that's favoritism. I don't know if that's just something Cam Smith is in the doghouse for, or why Eli Apple is inactive, or why the answer was, hey, let's take out Justin Bethel and put in Kelvin Joseph, who joined the team like 3 days before the season started. Something bad is going on in the secondary, and I fear that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think what gets it better is most likely Jalen Ramsey's return in a month or so. I also think that because of Javon Holland's success against Denver, there was too much trying to punch the ball out rather than securing tackles. Holland himself is probably guilty of that. But I also think it's pretty apparent that he and Deshaun Elliott function infinitely better than he and Brandon Jones function. I'm, based on some information I was given, I'm fairly certain Brandon Jones was kind of rushed back for this one. He was absolutely horrendous in the game. I said it last week, I'll say it again. You 1,000% re-signed Deshaun Elliott ahead of Brandon Jones. I think there are some specific niche roles that Brandon Jones could be wildly successful with in this defense, but I think a lot of that sort of hinges on your ability to have Deshaun Elliott on the field, your ability to play Kader Kohu in the other slot, and then Brandon Jones can be an overhang player. There's something amiss there where Kader Kohu is being identified as someone who can play outside. He just hasn't been good at it. I don't care what people try to say. You can go back and watch on Finside the NFL. We had to list our most overrated player, and I listed Kader Kohu specifically when he plays outside. I think I caught a few wild looks, and I know there were some fans in the chat on that show that were kind of like, what the fuck am I talking about? Sunday was what I'm talking about. He can't play outside in this league, and you can't do it against a blue-chip receiver. Xavier Howard basically had the day off. He was Darrelle Revis. No one even threw his way. I don't understand it. Howard said it after the game. You pay me all this money. I'm healthy. Something is not right. Something is amiss, and that needs to get fixed quick. I don't know if that's Fangio being stodgy and stubborn. I don't know if that's position coach kind of favoritism. I don't know if other players are in the doghouse for whatever reason. But it seems contemptibly stupid at this point to continue on without playing Cam Smith on the outside, at least until Jalen Ramsey's back. Keep Kohu in the slot. That makes your entire defense better. It gives you an overhang player against the run, which was kind of one of the few spots the Dolphins were vulnerable against Buffalo. And it allows you to get a bigger body on Stephon Diggs, or it allows you to man match him with Xavier Howard, or do whatever you need to. Sunday's plan, I don't think I've seen a worse one since Kevin Coyle was the defensive coordinator and for whatever God only knows reason tried to make Ndamukong Suh one technique. That's the level of stupidity we're facing with the game plan against the Bills on Sunday. Vic Fangio's much better than that. If he self-scouts himself, he's giving himself an F for this game, if he's being honest. It was downright terrible. The silver lining is I think there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit in terms of easy fixes you can do to get better. I've just outlined them. Let's keep an eye on it. The worry I have, and I talked about this, is you can probably get by the Giants and the Panthers with relative ease using the personnel the way you did against Buffalo. Those two teams don't present those matchup problems that Stephon Diggs did. But you're going to get boat raced on defense if you do that against Philly. You're going to get boat raced on defense if you do that against Kansas City. It is what it is. The other thing with Fangio, and you can look at this statistically, and it's borne out, back at his time from San Francisco. Well, I shouldn't say that. San Francisco, they were really good from the start. But in Chicago, they got better each of the 3 years there. They went from being ranked 28th in the league his first year to being the best defense across multiple categories by his last year in Chicago. And they got incrementally better in Denver each of his 3 years there as head coach. Got terrible hand dealt to him with the injuries to Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, and then subsequent injuries all over the defense the year after. But statistically, they did improve. I think what the biggest difference I look at is you look at the 49ers and Bears specifically, your two off-ball linebackers. In San Francisco, you had a phenomenal tandem, maybe the best tandem of off-ball linebackers we've seen since the 2000 Ravens or the 2002 Bucks in Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman. You're not recreating that, but you've at least got some speed with David Long, and I think you could have that with Channing Tindall if you give him the opportunities. He had that in Chicago with Danny Trevathan and Roquan Smith. I believe even brought Trevathan with him to Denver for a year. Jerome Baker is that caliber of an athlete, but it just is not playing or processing things at that speed at this point. You have to make a move. You have to make that move. I think up front, you very much have to make the move to put Andrew Van Ginkel ahead of Bradley Chubb once you get Jalen Phillips back. It sucks. It makes your general manager look bad, but if you want this defense to function in the manner in which it functions, those are the moves you need to make. And I know a lot of people are going to turn to, well, Fangio doesn't have the personnel to run the defense. And to a degree, that's true. You need better play at linebacker. You probably need more depth in terms of pass rush. You probably need more depth at safety that's better suited to the system. But the personnel with which you have now should not be this much worse than what you had last year. You look at what Josh Boyer did in a game with like a rookie Kader Kohou and having to start Verone McKinley and, just having to get mileage out of those defensive players, Xavier Howard being beaten up. Josh Boyer coached the pants off of Vic Fangio in terms of making a comparison 3 times out of 3 versus Fangio's game on Sunday. The upshot is that the fixes are easy to make in my eyes, and that would be something I'm very curious to see what happens over the next couple games, is do these fixes start to become a regular thing? And I know the money's supposed to be on the field at all times, or most of the time. I think you have to kind of throttle that back in terms of Bradley Chubb and Jerome Baker. I think you need to throttle back your use of Kader Kohou on the perimeter. You need to throttle back Andrew Van Ginkel as an off-ball linebacker at any degree. Just keep him on the edge. These are the fixes you need to make, and make immediately. So that's something to keep an eye on as we move forward here. That's all the time I've got for tonight. No preview of the Giants. I haven't really given them a second thought. They're still playing their game right now as I record this. A dismal day in Buffalo. The Bills, just for whatever reason, and Josh Allen specifically, have Miami's number. The good news is we get to play them again at the end of the season at home. That could still potentially be a big game if you right the ship, especially on defense, moving forward. You have to look forward to having back-to-back home games after taking 3 of the 4 on the road. But you've got to start fixing stuff, and it's easy stuff to fix. There's no way this defense should be this bad statistically. To anyone who's crying personnel, I call bullshit on that. There's a lot of easy changes they can make with the current personnel to improve this defense. And that's sort of the challenge Fangio has to face, and we'll see what he's all about. That's my time for this week. Hopefully we'll have a Victory Monday podcast. We'll dive back into some Lagavulin next Monday night. Thank you guys for listening. Again, follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. Follow the show on iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Fins up and enjoy your week. We'll see you next Sunday.